Thanks for joining us for another segment of the Truth Roundtable. As always, we have Professor of Media and Terrorism and first-year PhD student, Jim Collier. And over on this side, we have the president and co-founder of the Laissez-Faire Syndicate, Daniella Augenstein. And next to her is the co-founder and treasurer of the Laissez-Faire Syndicate, Adam Squicquero. Before we start our new topics this week, there have been some recent developments in our last week's discussion over the U.S. involvement in the Middle East. 18 bombings went off in Baghdad yesterday. Now the Iraqi government is asking us to stay a tad bit longer and help them out. I'll start with you, Jim. What are your thoughts?
Well, actually, Nouri al-Maliki, their prime minister, had been hinting that he wanted U.S. troops to stay longer before these bombings. So I think that's just going to speed things up. It's very tough, and it's the old adage: once you're in, it's very hard to get out. We have over 100,000 troops there still. There have continued, even though it's been out of the news, continued bombings. Generally, very much Sunni jihadi groups attacking mostly Shia Muslims and Iraqi police. It's been a huge problem. There's several hundred every few months, and I am very concerned that at any time things could erupt into a full-fledged civil war, simply because, as we talked earlier, these bombings of the Shia Muslims and the security forces have never stopped. And the Shia Muslims have been very, very reserved and not retaliated. And I think it's only a matter of time. And so something really has to give over there in terms of security. And I don't have all the answers, but it's very possible that we might be looking at a longer term occupation and not a troop withdrawal as has been planned.
And
I think you get into a mess like this, whether or not it was your mess to begin with, and I would say that this one largely was, you don't just so easily pull out. You don't just come under a new administration and suddenly they can say, we'll be out in a certain amount of time. It just doesn't work like that. Look at all of the other occupations that we've had throughout history. Everywhere that we have ever been militarily, we still are. We still occupy, to some extent, over 120 countries in this world. We don't leave once we're there. That has been the historical precedent, and I don't know why we would change that now, but it speaks to another important thing, and that is, what should the role have been over there? What should the role be in the future? We are in all of these countries, but should we be there? Is it maybe time to pull out? Is it maybe time to reduce the expenditures that we have as a rolling basis because of our constant occupation of all of these different areas? And it also speaks to the importance of the concept that Iraq was not ready to be let go. They were not ready to remove the training wheels. America is acting as de facto training wheels for the Iraqi government, or lack thereof, as it were. And we talked about waiting until they became a stable government and had a stable government so that we could pull out effectively and not have the entire place descend back into chaos, essentially. And they're obviously not there yet. So it almost seems as though it was simply a randomly chosen time frame by the current administration to say, we'll choose some number and that's when we'll leave, regardless of what's happening. And we can clearly see that that is just not what should be happening right now. It's not the best way to go about it.
And for me, I think what was most telling, because this just broke this morning, was when you looked at the pictures of the aftermath of the bombing. It was almost entirely United States soldiers that were inspecting the aftermath and securing the area. And I think if a bombing happens in the major city of a country, you would expect and hope that it would be the organizational apparatus of that country that would be able to take care of the aftermath, or even if they failed to secure the area, have some sort of plan in place to take care of the people in the area. But I mean, from what you could tell by the pictures, and it's a newly breaking story, that wasn't the case. It was, again, the military of the United States that was there to do that. So I think that shows that the people or the military and police of Iraq aren't necessarily totally ready for us to leave. And I think that it was irresponsible for the current administration to just decide that they would have to be ready whenever we wanted to leave. That being said, it's our fault that they have to be in this situation in the first place from a short-term perspective of simply removing the entire police and military apparatus in 2003, right after the invasion, and from a more historical long-term perspective of supporting whichever random regime was in place at the time, because they may or may not have given us some short-term benefit. I think that it's really sort of our mess to make better, and it's going to take time, and that's just what we're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how far back you want to trace it. Oddly enough, Iraq was a very modern society under that fascist regime. The West used Iraq in the 80s to punish Iran, overthrowing a police state that we had put in place in the 50s by overthrowing a parliamentary democracy. So we ally ourselves with a fascist murdering regime for 8 years. We're done with them. Well, now what do? Iraq had been militarized, so we needed to take them apart. And so it's like long-term, short-term thinking. They had a use, they performed their use at great cost to the domestic population there. We blew Iraq out of Kuwait in the early 90s, decided to leave Saddam in power, sanctioned them for another 11 years, then invaded. So we basically created a failed state, and that's what you're looking at right now in Iraq. It's a failed state, and it's going to take perhaps decades for them to recover and be on their own. And in my opinion, we are morally obligated to see that through, having blown the state apart. But at some point, they have to take charge. But then again, where does this responsibility separate?
Right. That's what
on we go.
We have been there for, you said, since 2003, so it's going on about 8 years. I mean, how much longer can we stay with them? I guess that's one of the thoughts. Is some people are wondering, we have been here 8 years. When is it time that they take control? When can we finally get out of there? I mean, you do want to see it through, but at what point do you draw the line? Mm-hmm. Do you guys have any thoughts on?
Well, as with any global conflict, as with any war between states, you have that initial outpouring of nationalism and patriotism and support for the government. Right after 9/11, Bush's approval rating was, 93, 96%? It was really, really high. But it plummeted shortly thereafter because these things wear off. People react to these issues emotionally. And so in that moment, they will say, well, we need to be there as long as we need to get the job done. But a couple of months later, when they're not seeing the benefits as tangibly as they believe that they should, and it makes sense that they wouldn't because they're not on the ground, they begin to lose faith, they begin to lose hope, and they begin to stop supporting what they initially supported. And as you see, the approval ratings drop, you see the support for the wars drop. It's happened in both of the world wars that we were both times we were heavily involved in. And you initially get that outpouring of an emotional reaction that says, yes, let's do what we need to do. And it very quickly dissipates because people don't see what they thought they would be seeing. And in terms of the public opinion of the pulling out of an occupation or an occupational area, I think it's much shorter than the practical timeline. The public opinion would say that you need to leave far earlier than you really need to if you in fact went in the first place, and that is the root of the problem. The root of the problem is not what the timeline is necessarily. At this point it is because we're already there. But the real question is, should we ever have been there? Should we ever have been in any of these given issues that we could go back as far as you want to and discuss them? And that is the true root of the problem. It's the difference between punching someone in the face and then handing them an ice pack, or just not doing it in the first place. Which is better?
I think when we were considering going to war in the first place in 2003, the case was made that it was in our interest because of the threat from weapons of mass destruction, Saddam's support for terrorism. Some of that panned out and some of it didn't, but I at this point, 8 years later, still don't see any tangible benefit to this country for having spent multiple trillions of dollars, having quite a few casualties in the tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers. And I don't know how long it will be before, from a benefit standpoint, that'll pan out. When will we realize any benefit? When will anyone realize any benefit from the actions that occurred during that war? I mean, obviously Saddam Hussein was a terrible dictator, and the people of Iraq, the ones that were able to come here during the aftermath of the war, are incredibly thankful that they were able to come here because of the removal of Saddam Hussein. And the people that were being persecuted are thankful. But, you know, that it's a terrible situation. There's tons and tons of violence occurring there every day. And at what point are we finally willing to say and analyze our international relations policy and our, I guess, just policy in general going forward to say what is important to us when we're making these types of decisions? Is it our interest? Is it truly our interest, or are we going to try and say that we're acting altruistically internationally just because we think that's what people want to hear, and sort of have to hide going after our own interests? Are we going to be honest with people in the future and actually do the things that will result, without violating people's rights internationally and domestically? Will we be able to, going forward, actually be honest with ourselves about what we should be doing? And I think that remains to be seen.
Well, just in finishing up that topic, it really gets down to all of us need to decide: are we going to be a strong republic, or are we going to have an empire? And as Daniella mentioned, we have military personnel in 126 countries. Some are just in a few hundred, some in 100,000, like Iraq, Afghanistan. The larger issue with Iraq, and we'll have to move on here, but I'd love to get into this. There was actually overwhelming publicly available evidence that there were no WMD, that Iraq was demilitarized by 1998 when Clinton pulled the inspectors out. That's another topic. But ongoing, there are a number of economists that have estimated the Iraq war ultimately will cost us, at a running total right now, of over $3 trillion. We have nearly 5,000 dead. We have 40,000 permanently wounded Americans, 200,000 dead Iraqis and counting. And again, it's all short-term thinking. It's all short-term thinking. And it's an unfolding tragedy. And as Daniella said, when do you pull out? Well, when are you morally obligated to pull out? Can you pull out? Because we have a failed state that is much to our doing. As much of a gangster and murderer as Saddam Hussein was, he didn't come from nowhere. So,
also speaking to this point is that it's just not in Iraq, but also in different countries all over the world, as you were saying.